Welcome to the second session of History of Indian Economy since Independence. We discussed about the first 20 years of the Indian economy and the industrial policy since independence, and I asked all of you to study about the three implications of the industrial policies that we had discussed. And as far as I recollect, today Raju will be the one to enlighten us about the implications. Raju?
What are the three implications of the industrial policy adopted by Nehru's government in the 50s and 60s?
Sir, it was not me. It was Meek who was supposed to prepare for this question.
No, you idiot. It was you.
I would protect the business from imports. Exactly. And that is what we should talk about in the next session. The implications of policies in 50s and 60s and early 70s. Raju, you should read up about these three topics and you will explain each implication in more detail when we meet next.
Now, pull your own ears and remain like this for this session. Alright, the rest of you use the references I've given in the chat and read out the implications one by one. Hari, you go first.
Well, why not? So, there are three main implications. Increased role of public sector. Quoting some research report from Professor Aditya Bhattacharjee, it was believed that private investment would not be forthcoming for such capital-intensive projects because they are characterized by long gestation periods, which means there's a lot of time before they can yield profit.
Seems logical, isn't it? Private entrepreneurs don't like long gestation periods. They like quick returns. And they may also not have sufficient capital to begin with. So, go on.
The 1948 Industrial Policy Resolution, or the IPR, had already reserved production of arms and ammunitions for central government, and new establishments for the manufacture of iron and steel or aircraft, ships, telephone, telegraph, and wireless equipment were reserved for undertakings owned by the central or the state governments. Existing private producers in these industries would continue, but nationalization could be considered after 10 years, which means becoming a PSU possibly. The list of industries reserved for public sector was expanded in 1956 to cover 14 industries in which new establishments were to be set up only by the state. The public sector could also enter any other industry. Also, after the 1955 Avadi session of the ruling Congress party, government had committed itself to building a socialistic pattern of society where the state was to control the commanding heights of the economy.
That is correct. Socialistic pattern of society. Alright, now let's have Meek read about the next implication. Meek?
So the next implication is licensing, which is needed to allocate scarce resources to higher priority industries. And this could not be achieved through market mechanisms because the public sector could not bid the resources away from more profitable industries that were left for private sector.
That means certain resources like land could be more profitably utilized by private sector. And therefore, if market was to drive this allocation, the land would be taken by private players. So, go on.
It was also supposed to control the concentration of economic power and protect small-scale industries and promote regional balance in industrialization.
Market mechanisms would have resulted in a skewed development of industries geographically, for example. So while it would make more sense to make a machine tool factory in an industrial area or an industrial state, the government of the day decided to establish, for example, Hindustan Machine Tools or HMT in Bangalore, which at the time was not an industrialized area. And this was done to ensure more equitable distribution of industrial development across the country and across states.
Yes. So, going on. Under the Industries Development and Regulation Act in 1951, private firms had to apply for licenses to set up a new factory or significantly expanding the capacity or changing the location of an existing factory or even to produce new products. So they required permission to import foreign technology also. Limits were imposed on the duration of technical collaboration agreements, as well as fees and royalties that were to be paid to foreign technology licensors.
So, if you recall from our previous session about Raju's mom's bakery shop, so if Raju's mother wanted to start making ovens for these bakeries, she would be required to apply for a license. If she then wishes to make 100 ovens instead of 50, she would need a license. And if she wants to move the plant from, let's say, Delhi to Chennai, she would again need a license. If she needs to import some coils which are made in China, she would need permissions. And these permissions would be provided for a limited duration. Are you able to picture the scenario? Alright, Hari, take the third one.
Yep, for sure. So, new industries would need protection from import competition because they would be operating with unfamiliar technologies and at uneconomically small scales of production. So, high tariffs of up to 300% for some items were introduced, and a regime of strict import licensing for almost all the goods.
Yep, absolutely. Raju, clap for Hari and Meek. Now, there is a fourth implication, which is resultant of these policies. Since there were licensing restrictions on both domestic production and imports, when demand grew, there were shortages in supply chain and therefore prices rose. Since a lot of these goods were essential, government applied pricing controls which resulted in further shortages. To control which, they also implemented distribution control in the form of rations.
और ये क्या है? ये है वर्ल्ड कप. इससे इधर से नापो या इधर से नापो. 5 की जगह सिर्फ 2.5 लीटर ही मिलता है.
You may have heard from your parents or grandparents about rations and how they would have stood in queues at stores to get the ration of edible oil every week. In some cases, like cement, cloth, and sugar, a dual pricing mechanism or dual pricing scheme was enforced by the government. And therefore, the industry had to sell a share of its output at a controlled price to the government or any other authorized buyers. And the rest of the market, they bought it at market determined prices. So, government would buy a private company's output, for example steel, at a much lower controlled price, and the private company would be compelled to sell to them.
That is a shit show.
Well, yes. But given that there was a very small opposition, which also was more or less socialist and communist, I doubt the outcome of anyone else being in power would be very different in terms of economics. And of course, there were other options, which were more market driven, like larger allocation to military, technology, weapons, and ammunition. A more market driven approach or privatized approach may have ensured higher productivity, efficiencies, and competitiveness. So, for example, look at the ordnance factories of India. What sense does it make to have them spread across the country and not in a cluster? These are policies implemented for populism and not growth. The sheer audacity of the then government to take away Air India and nationalize it, to go to the UN for Pakistan and Kashmir, to ignore defense production and industry in favor of Hindi Chini Bhai Bhai, that ultimately led to...
Sir, I meant Big Boss is a shit show, sir.
Yeah, it was pretty much like Big Boss. Yeah. Raju, read my notes aloud to the class about the fallouts of this policy.
Okay. So thanks to the steep import tariffs, and local producers could cash in on the scarcity gain. When you've got a monopoly or an oligopoly, you can jack up prices way more than a tariff would typically let you do. So it was a nice trick for those who were holding all the cards. Importing most consumer goods was a no-no. So industrialists wanting raw materials had to jump through hoops like licenses, certificates of essentiality, and proof of indigenous non-availability. And this last bit meant anything made in India could not be imported. So that gave local producers a monopoly. And this also hurt industries relying on these goods. It forced them to buy from local suppliers no matter what the cost or quality of that product was. So, tough times for competitiveness.
Yep, tough times for competitiveness. Think about it. Can we actually trust the competence of babus to determine the essentiality of inputs required for hundreds of industries? And what happens in this scenario? Take a guess.
Malpractices set in.
Exactly. And big business groups with offices in Delhi and close connections got licenses that were unused, meaning they were just procured to keep the competition out.
Yes, and then came in the renewed commitment to the socialism era of Indira Gandhi, followed by Jan Sangh. Restrictions on the private sector expanded greatly. So many loss making manufacturing firms were nationalized to save and generate jobs. And around the same time, 14 major banks and coal mines and Indian operations of multinational oil companies were nationalized. The Monopolies and Restrictive Trade Practices, or the MRTP Act, which was passed in 69, the Foreign Exchange Regulation Act, or the FERA, in 73, reinforced license Raj and protectionism. The number of items reserved for small scale industries increased from 30 to nearly 200, and the number jumped to over 800 under the Janata Party regime from 1977 to 80.
And you thought India actually had a right wing? No. In 1976, a new rule hit the Industrial Disputes Act. Factories with 300 plus workers needed the government's nod to let them go. Now jump to the 70 Patents Act. It pumped up Indian pharma by allowing process patents for 7 years. Others got 14. So that's cool, right? But wait, there's more. Price control rolled into pharma scene, and the list of regulated drugs just kept on growing over 20 years. So eventually, economists like Pulapre Balakrishnan in 2022 highlighted the remarkable growth rates achieved during the Nehru era in India, which surpassed both the colonial times and the contemporary rates in China, US, UK, and Japan. They dispelled two misconceptions about the era. So, public sector enterprises generated budget surpluses and private investment also accelerated. That was true. However, performance declined in the subsequent 15 years up to 1980. Manufacturing growth halved, with registered manufacturing dropping from 8.3% to 2.7% per annum. While there was a slight recovery, India fell behind East and Southeast Asian countries, especially in industrialization and export. So, what went wrong? The first 30 years saw heavy public investment in industries and infrastructure. But what it also saw was protectionism and licensing restrictions. The implementation of controls was often arbitrary, which led to inefficiencies. The system was opaque and there was a lot of corruption, which led to losses to the public sector. Taxation and deficit financing to cover these losses, they worsened inflation and inequality. Right? So they tried to use taxation to solve the growing problem, but they were using all the money to just keep on financing whatever deficit was being generated, and in turn, as it happens, inflation increases. They also tried a shallow attempt to devalue the currency, which also did not help. Generally, you devalue currency when you're looking to increase your exports. But this attempt did not help much because it also came with import liberalization. So essentially, on balance, it didn't really make a lot of difference. And it was politically not something that could be sold. So eventually, economy remained subservient to political agenda, even when the political agenda was also subservient to interests of a select few. Acts like the MRTP, they barred successful larger conglomerates from growing. It limited their licenses to capital intensive businesses that eventually made them work in very labor intensive markets, and it also restricted their growth. The policy also inadvertently led to the growth of small and low wage factories, and it displaced traditional employment. Any attempts to curb economic power concentration, they failed, as eventually business groups manipulated regulations to their advantage. So, tell me, did this so-called socialism work? And think about it. What are the conditions in which it would actually work? Are these conditions realistic?
कुछ काम वाम करना है आज या खुद को ही देखते रहोगे पूरा दिन लैपटॉप पे?
Okay, guys, students, that is it for today. We shall ponder on these questions next week. See you. Bye bye.